I want to start with the old vision of what a government regulator would do. Okay, we go back to the 70s and 80s when the government would set up an organization. Then this was a bit of a jagirdari. So our idea is that there is a feudal lord and he has control of some land. So that is turf. Okay, and in that he does central planning. He basically decides what is the shape and contours of the industry. He makes decisions about production and technology of whether it is good to use aluminum cans to make soft drinks or not. And there was a lot of arbitrary power. So the word of the Lord was the final word. And this gave us low financial development. This gave us problems of corruption and so on. And from the early 90s, we have been searching for a new concept of what is financial regulation. So we were clear, we don't want central planning, we don't want jagirdari, we don't want for a government that will hold back financial development, and we don't want the corruption. Okay, so we want a clean modern arrangement, and we have been in this search for 20 years for what is the nature of that modern arrangement. And it is enormously insightful to focus on a legal perspective in this. The legal point is that Parliament delegates the power to write laws to the regulator. And we should transfix ourselves with this thought. It is an enormous sacred power when an unelected official is given the ability to write law. Okay? Parliament derives legitimacy from elections. Okay? So at the end of the day, Parliament has the power to write law and is legitimately given the power to write law because they win elections. But people like us who are mere humble officials inside a regulator, how do we derive legitimacy to write law? And there is a huge line that has been crossed when we have given a regulatory organization the power to write law. And in my opinion, we have not thought about it enough in the past decades. I think a lot more care is required before we place this power to write law in the hands of a regulator. And when we study our experiences of the things that went wrong, and when we study the successes of how good regulatory organizations work elsewhere in the world, it teaches us three things. The first is that this delegation between the principal and the agent, between Parliament, stroke government, and a regulator, can only work when there is clarity on objectives. Okay? So it can never be a jagirdari. It can never be that there is this aviation sector, you are the regulator of the aviation sector. So a skimpy, short law which gives sweeping powers to do whatever you like with a sector, that is entirely inappropriate. There has to be clarity on objectives. There has to be a precise statement of what the regulator will do. Otherwise, we are asking for trouble. And intimately linked to that is there have to be precise powers. There have to be limited powers. Okay, let me give you an example of the sorts of things that are simply inappropriate in a modern vision of regulation. All of you will know Section 11B of the SEBI Act, which gives SEBI the ability to pursue, double quotes, the public interest. This is asking for trouble because the word public interest can mean anything under the sun. Essentially, any action of SEBI can be justified on the grounds that it constitutes the pursuit of public interest. So vague words like public interest or welfare or we will do things that are good for the people of India have no place in modern thinking about regulation. And similarly, when you look at powers, you will see many old laws where there is power, 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 and then there will be a last one, any other power thought suitable by the board. Okay, that's again asking for trouble. So in the limit, if you create a regulator where there is ambiguous objective such as public welfare, and there is unlimited power, then you've really set yourself up for a lot of trouble. So the second piece that we require is a precise statement of the most limited powers that are required to achieve the stated objectives. Okay, so there should be no powers other than the minimum powers that are required to achieve the stated objectives. And the third pillar is accountability. Okay, so you create an organization. So Parliament stroke government creates an organization, gives it precise objectives, gives it the precise and limited powers, and then we need to create an array of accountability mechanisms through which
the agent will actually perform, the agent will actually deliver, the agent will actually give you the outcome that you require. And in my mind, the biggest single element of that accountability process is just the rule of law. Okay, a simple adherence to the great idea of the 18th century will carry us a long way. That if we just fill our hearts with the concept of rule of law, and in every single thing that we do, we keep pushing on enhancing the rule of law, then 90% of the problem is going to get solved. And in some sense, this is the heart and soul of what has been done in FSLRC. Clarity on objectives, precise objectives, and an endless push in favor of accountability and rule of law. And that will give us a working arrangement through which these organizations will work properly. Now let me turn to objectives. Okay, so you create an agent and you are saying, what should his objectives be? What should his precise objectives be? This takes you to an economics question. What should government do? Why do I want a government at all? Okay, so in many situations, the free market does well and you don't want a government. So that is like a deregulation agenda, that we do not want India to be a socialist republic. We wish to be a modern, mature market economy. So we want to get away from arbitrary meddling and arbitrary control, but we do want a government to do certain things. What are those certain things? And a precise technical statement of that is, we want a government to address market failures. Okay, and the word market failure is a word made precise in microeconomics. So the word market failure has 200 years of research going into it. So roughly speaking, the free market does everything fine other than market failures. At the level of high economics, there is a clear demarcation of three groups of market failures. The first is externalities. I am emitting pollution, it gives you lung cancer. Okay, so my actions are impeding on you, and therefore welfare is enhanced when the government will meddle with my life and will prevent me from emitting pollution. Okay, so that's the first kind of market failure, that's an externality. The second kind of market failure is asymmetric information. I am going to buy a medicine in the market. I am not aware about whether that medicine is contaminated or not. So there is value in a government that sets up a Food and Drug Administration that will verify the purity of the drugs and put people who make fake and counterfeit drugs into jail. Okay, so that is a market failure called asymmetric information, and we require interventions such as a Food and Drug Administration in order to address that. And the third market failure is market power, when there is monopoly power. Okay, now the way India has gone is the way many other countries have gone, is that the overarching problem of market power, of monopoly power, has been placed with the Competition Commission of India. Okay, and this is a very interesting point. Every single sectoral power structure in India protested when the CCI was being set up. Okay, so the electricity guys said, the CCI is fine for everything else, but on electricity, I will do it. Okay, the telecom guys said, CCI is fine for everything else, but on telecom, I will do it. Okay, and Parliament thought about this, and Parliament said, no, competition is orthogonal to whatever else you guys are doing. So in addition to all the other agencies, we will have a single unified CCI. Okay, and I happen to think that's a good arrangement, but whether I think it's good or not, that is what Parliament thought, and that is what we have in India. So competition is a consideration that comes into a lot of what we do in finance, and we should always cater to more competition, but really the overarching responsibility for competition has been placed with CCI, and that's a reasonably good arrangement. Translating this abstract economic idea of asymmetric information, externalities, and market power, translating these three into the field of finance, we get four areas where you wish for a government to be interfering with the freedom of private citizens and private firms. Those four areas are consumer protection, microprudential regulation, resolution, and systemic risk. Okay, so all of you would have seen the FSLRC report, and this is the clear strategy inside FSLRC. Consumer protection, microprudential regulation, resolution, and systemic risk are four places where we require government intervention, are the only four places where we require government intervention. Any other actions by a government interfering inside the freedom of private firms and private agents are inappropriate. Okay, so it's a clarity of a limited mandate that we require a government to pursue consumer protection. We require a government to pursue microprudential regulation. We require a government to do systemic risk regulation, and we require a government to do resolution. And we require a government to do nothing else, to deregulate everything else. So we need a government to get out of the way on everything else and pursue these four goals. As you would know, in the IFC, there are also 5 other blocks, but they don't constitute the main line. The main line of financial regulation is consumer protection, microprudential regulation, systemic risk regulation, and resolution. There are 5 other blocks in the IFC. There is capital controls, debt management, monetary policy, development, and the foundations of properties and contracts and securities law. Okay, so I just want to mention them here, but conceptually there are really 4 big things where you want regulation, and they are consumer protection, microprudential regulation, resolution, and systemic risk. That's on the objectives. Now I turn to the regulatory governance. This is the question of public administration. How do we create a body of administrative law and management structure and public administration wisdom on how we run regulators so that we achieve competent, capable, world-class, uncorrupt regulators? Okay, that is the challenge that we face. All of us know the problems that we see with regulators in India today. All of us look at good quality regulators in some of the best countries in the world, and we are endlessly envious that why can't we build those kinds of agencies? In this, it's very important for us to see one of the problems that I started by saying Parliament has given a sacred power to the regulator, that of writing law. Okay, so there is a legislative function that has been placed in a regulator. In addition, that regulator enforces the law. So an executive function has been placed in the regulator. And in addition, the regulator writes orders. That's a judicial function that's been placed in the regulator. This violates concepts of separation of powers. Okay, so separation of powers is a doctrine that has evolved over hundreds of years, which teaches us that there is a lot to be gained by keeping these 3 separate. Okay, you want Parliament to enact the Indian Penal Code. You want the police to enforce the Indian Penal Code. You want a judge to write the order. And it is good and healthy that these 3 things are kept separate. Okay, so the public administration problem of a regulator lies in the fact that we have conflated these 3 together, and it generates all kinds of problems. When the IFC is enacted, some of these problems will be improved because the quasi-judicial function is being cleaned up under the IFC. But even without the IFC, I feel all of us should be very mindful and cognizant that by conflating the legislative, executive, and judicial function inside an organization, we have set ourselves up to fail in public administration. Okay, so that's a deep insight. Over and over and over, why have regulators in India done badly? And one of the answers is because you're asking for an impossible problem. When you ask any bureaucracy to perform a legislative and an executive and a judicial function together, it is going to mess up. Separation is a good thing. If the separation is not done outside, the separation should be done inside. And this shapes our thinking about organization design. How would you write the organization chart of a regulator? Gets deeply influenced by this way of thinking. And this is a body of knowledge coming from public administration and law. It is not a body of knowledge coming from economics. Okay, so I feel we should be clear that there is a role for economics. Economics teaches us about market failures. It teaches us about the objectives of financial regulation. But the discipline of economics does not teach us about management. It does not teach us about public administration. To do sound management of regulators, we are going to need to tap into the world of public administration and law. And that is where the knowledge lies. The clarity on how to organize a regulator comes from those fields. And I will suggest that we need to drink from the separation of powers doctrine and try to mirror that inside regulatory organizations. So we recognize that we are facing a very difficult problem when I am an FMC or I am a SEBI or I am an RBI, but we should be mindful of that and use this knowledge to do better organization design. I would encourage all of you to study the IFC on these questions of regulatory governance, and in connection with what Krishnan said a moment ago, when there are badly worded laws, when there are vaguely worded laws, this has led to all kinds of problems. We hope that you will see that in the IFC there's a considerable improvement in the precision of language. There is simple English, there is plain English, and there is a lot more precision. You will be delighted that words like must are used and words like may are avoided and words like shall are avoided. Okay, so you will see a lot of precision. It's plain English. There is not even one Latin phrase in the full IFC and so on. So on the whole subject of regulatory governance, please go look at the IFC because that's a full body of the thinking on regulatory governance. We are here in this room today because of a delightful situation that the leadership of all the regulators of India and the leadership of the Ministry of Finance agreed on the handbook. Okay, so it's a very big moment in India's history where there is an agreement between all financial agencies and the Ministry of Finance that we will reshape all financial agencies of India using the handbook. So the handbook has a status of agreement of all the agencies in India that we will shift to a higher standard of working. And roughly speaking, I will say handbook constitutes 80% of the goodness of the IFC on regulatory governance and maybe 60% of the consumer protection. The rest of IFC is still outside. It stands separately and there is stuff moving on that. For example, the Urjit Patel report is a big step forward in moving towards the IFC in terms of clarifying the objective of monetary policy, doing inflation targeting, all that good stuff. So there are many other pieces moving. What the handbook is doing is it is taking 80% of the goodness of IFC on regulatory governance and 40%, 50% of what is in IFC on consumer protection. And it is a huge moment for us in terms of learning how to do financial regulation and design and create high quality, effective, capable financial regulators in India. I'd like to walk through the table of contents of the handbook. So can I please request all of you to go to page 2 of the handbook, and I will locate what's in the handbook in connection with what I've just been saying. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the handbook are consumer protection. Okay? Consumer protection in the IFC is a precisely stated objective. Consumer protection in traditional Indian laws is a vaguely stated objective. So the strategy has been to utilize existing Indian law but translate that into a better statement of what we will do in consumer protection. Okay, so that's chapter 2 and chapter 3. And as you can see, this affects everybody. It affects RBI, it affects SEBI, it affects IRDA, it affects PFRDA, it affects FMC and so on. So for example, the adoption of chapter 2 and chapter 3 will ensure that there will never be a SEBI, IRDA, RBI complexity on insurance mis-selling again. Okay, chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are the regulatory governance. Okay, and that's the main body of what will happen in the remainder of this workshop. Okay, so that is the main business of how regulation is done, of how regulations will be produced, how they will be enforced, and how orders will be produced, how quasi-judicial process and checks and balances will be surrounded with that, how penalties will become more rational and more consistent with the magnitude of the crime. Chapter 13 is a broad statement about capacity building initiatives. What Krishnan mentioned, that institutions associated with all the regulatory agencies will be requested to cooperate, and there will be a unified certification examination. So you will see in chapter 13 that there will be an examination, and the heads of all the agencies have agreed that 33% of the staff of all the regulators will pass the exam every year. Okay, so over a 3-year period, 100% of all professional employees of all the regulatory agencies and the Ministry of Finance will have passed the exam. And finally, there's chapter 14, which has some implementation stuff. Okay, so this gives you a flavor of what's in the handbook, and that is the task before us. And as you finish with today and tomorrow on all the talks and the discussion that will take place, I would encourage you to think more deeply about your home organizations. Really rebuilding financial regulation in India to come up to world class and to properly implement the handbook and the IFC requires deep changes. It requires us to do 100% clean room redesign of the organization, of the process manuals, and of the skills. And that's the task before us, and all of us in this room are going to be playing this sort of question together, and we are in for a very exciting time. So the distinction that I would make is that the handbook has the status of a decision by the heads of all the regulatory agencies and the Ministry of Finance, and the IFC is a question that will be posed to the next parliament. But with the handbook in hand, we actually have our hands full. There's tons of work that's waiting to be done, and all of us can get going, and it builds towards implementing the IFC. So in fact, if in principle the next Prime Minister and the next Finance Minister said that we will take IFC to Parliament and get it passed within 6 months, it would be a huge problem because we don't have the implementation capability. It would be a law that is passed and we just don't have the commensurate state capacity to make it work in a meaningful way, which itself would generate a lot of problems. Look at the mess that happened around Companies Act in terms of translating the enactment at Parliament into actual operations. So it's better that we do it like this. It is better that we build state capacity ahead of time and we have adequate planning leading up to the date when the IFC becomes the law. Okay, so I'm finished with what I had to say. Are there any thoughts and comments and questions and any funny stories that anybody else would like to contribute into this?